Hi everybody. I apologize very much for having to cancel class this morning. Unfortunately, I got stuck on the crosstown and had to pull off because I drive a very low car and it was very flooded. And I just had to sit there for 2 hours until floodwaters receded. Yay for living in Charleston. Anyway, because of the last flood days, we are a little bit behind. So I thought I would do a short video lecture going over conformity and stereotypes today so that we can pick up with social influence on Wednesday. So if you remember last class, we were talking about the bystander effect and how that happens because of a diffusion of responsibility. So when nobody takes responsibility for that action, typically responsibility is diffused among people, and people just kind of follow each other. So today we're going to get into more of a discussion of why people follow each other, so conformity. Okay, so the basic definition of conformity is a change in behavior or attitudes brought about by a desire to follow the beliefs or standards of other people. So looking at other people and watching what they do. Now there's a really cool study that was done in 1951 by Solomon Asch, and it was the very first study that kind of looked at conformity. And what we're going to do is we're going to watch that right now.
The Asch experiment is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research. A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example,
the actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1, 1, 1. 2,
1. Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3, 3, 3,
3.
The Asch experiment has been repeated many times, and the results have been supported again and again. We will conform to the group. Again, we're very social creatures. We're very much aware of what the people around us think. We want to be liked. We don't want to be seen to rock the boat, so we will go along with the group. Even if we don't believe what people are saying, we'll still go along.
1. Group dynamics is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology.
1.
Okay, so in our Asch experiment there, you can see the guy struggle. He knows that the answers are wrong, but he doesn't want to break the grain of the group. And typically speaking, that's generally what people do, which is why group dynamics is so interesting and why conformity in itself is a really hot topic. We have this strong desire to be part of a group and stay part of a group. And that's what that guy was doing in that study. He's trying very, very hard to make sure he's part of the group. Now, there are 4 things that generally increase conformity. And the first one is the group characteristics. So what kind of people do you have there? Are there a lot of people? Are there a couple of people? Are they attractive? meaning attractive social status. Do they have things that you want or need? So how is that group made up, and are you pressured to be part of that group? The next is the situation. As we just saw in the ASH experiment, when giving public responses, we're going to be more likely to conform because we don't want to be the one guy that kind of does not conform with others. So when we give public responses, we're going to typically conform to behavior. However, think about our guy in the ASH experiment. If he was giving private responses, would he give the correct response or the response that everybody else was giving? He'd probably give the correct one because nobody's going to see that, so nobody knows that he's not being a team player, so to speak. Generally speaking, ambiguous tasks actually lend themselves for more conformity than defined tasks. The reason being is if you're given an ambiguous task, think about it, it's like diffusion of responsibility. You've got to kind of look to other people to figure out that ambiguity. And because of that, the conformity aspect can be a lot more powerful because you've really got to work as a group to figure out what's going on there. Where if you have a defined task, it's a little bit easier to dole out responsibility and get to work. In addition, there's the opinion versus fact scenario. And generally speaking, people are actually more likely to conform when they're giving an opinion and not a fact-based answer. And the reason why is because you can just tell somebody your opinion, but it doesn't have to be your actual belief. You can just tell them your opinion is whatever their opinion is, and you don't really have to worry about how you appear, and it doesn't affect you in any way, shape, or form because your belief is still your belief. So opinions lend themselves a little bit more to conformity than facts. And then the last thing here is the social supporter. So is there someone else in the group that also has an opposing view? If so, that person is what's called a social supporter. And having somebody support an opposing position actually makes it more likely that you will state your opposing position. If somebody else is breaking the grain of the group, then it's okay for you as well. You're not the first person, so you're good to go, and that actually really breaks conformity quite a bit. Now, we do have to examine group influence on individual behavior, and there's a couple of concepts here. One that's not listed is called social facilitation, and social facilitation is this idea that sometimes when people get in a group, they actually perform better. By having the support of the group, they perform much better. Now, the opposite of that is what you see here, and that's social loafing. So typically, we've all met these people. You're doing a group project. You feel like you're doing all the work. There's one person who just hasn't contributed very much. That is social loafing. And that's kind of a diffusion of responsibility. So think about when you work on group projects. Group projects are notoriously hated by everybody, and it's because everybody feels like they're doing the work, and there's always the one person that does nothing. And that's what happens here. They don't have to work as hard because everybody's contributing, meaning they can work less and the product will still get done. That's social loafing. And then there is the de-individuation piece, which we saw in the prison study. People lose their identity when they're part of a group. That happens a decent amount. So often when people are not self-aware, then they're a group rather than themselves. Now, we need to talk about groupthink a little bit because it's kind of a big deal, and there have been lots of large-scale disasters that are the result of groupthink. Groupthink is where a group has a strong motivation to achieve something or achieve consensus, whatever it might be, that they fail to look at all sides of a situation. This is a big deal in jury decision making. I don't know if you've seen the movie 12 Angry Men, but the movie 12 Angry Men is specifically centered around this idea of groupthink. I know that your book covers the Challenger disaster and how groupthink was probably a problem in that situation where, you know, we have the space shuttle, it's ready to go. They kind of know there's a problem with it, but nobody says anything because there's such a strong motivation to get everybody on board so that they could get the launch underway. And it turned into a huge disaster. Finally, this right here is what you typically see in cult behavior. So I don't know if anybody has watched any of the news or anything with Leah Remini, who just left Scientology and has done a number of public interviews. If you listen to her interviews, she really does go through all of this groupthink stuff. It's pretty amazing to listen to her. There's also a HBO documentary on Scientology called Going Clear that's pretty good, and it shows the same thing. It shows all of these symptoms. So start with the first one. Symptom number 1, the illusion of invulnerability. You think you're invincible. The group thinks that nothing can stop them. Scientology is definitely a pretty good example of this. They have Tom Cruise. Nobody can touch them. They are plowing their way forward. There is this idea and a belief in inherent morality. So they actually think their behavior is okay. They think that their behavior is better than other people and they're superior. And that seems to be consistent across the group. There is this little trick of pressuring dissenters. So if anybody speaks out, they get pressured to conform back to the group. And that's one of the number one things you see with things that have been defined cults. Like, well, Scientology is still debatable. Some people call it a cult, some people don't. But if you call it a cult, you'll see that they do pressure dissenters. The Jim Jones situation, there was a lot of pressuring to get people to stay within the group. Then there was the whole Heaven's Gate thing. Same thing. You've got to stay within the group, or the entire group exerts a lot of pressure on you. Let's see, there's collective rationalization. So people are kind of thinking in conjunction, and nobody really rationalizes with an opposing view. These people have stereotyped views of an out group. That's pretty common, but that's pretty common with all behavior. So, you know, in-group, out-group stuff, which we'll go over when we get to stereotypes here in a second. People suffering from groupthink tend to do self-censorship. They do not want to break the flow of the group. That's very bad. If they do, they're then going to be pressured. And then there are the self-appointed mind guards. So these are people that have to make sure that you're still on board. Now, in part of that Leah Remini interview, where she's talking about Scientology, she talks about meeting Tom Cruise's children, I think it's two children that he had with Nicole Kidman. And the two children actually don't talk to their mother anymore. And they don't talk to their mother anymore. They call her an SP, which is suppressive person. So that's part of the pressure that you get here in this cult behavior, is they separate you from people that are going to try and change your mind. So that's what a mind guard is going to do. They're going to watch your behavior, and they kind of separate you from everybody else. This is a non-cult example, but there was some serious groupthink going on here. If you guys don't remember, the Penn State scandal was the situation where there was sexual misconduct with young children at a football camp. And high-level administration at Penn State was found to actually cover all this up. So it was brought to their attention back when it was happening, and they quieted the whole thing. And realistically, if you look back at their actions, it was just groupthink. There was actually somebody that did report the behavior, but they were quieted, and they were quieted quickly so it didn't go public. The kids were low income that were being sexually assaulted, and that was a stereotyped out group. People that were interviewed said a number of times about how the children were low income. There was some sort of stereotype going on where they believed it wasn't hurting them because they're low income, it's fine. Them coming to the football camp is just an honor anyway. They did think they were invulnerable, right? I mean, they hid this for years, so they never thought that anybody was going to find out. And even if you watch the interviews that they had with some of the people involved, they still didn't really seem like anything bad was going to happen to them after all of this. They did have a collective rationalization, so there was no chance to voice any opinion. The group made a decision together, and then again, morality wasn't there. But if you listen to some of the interviews, some of it they really think that they were doing the correct thing. So they thought that they were being moral, even though they weren't. And the last thing with conformity and group stuff here that I want to talk about is group polarization. So group polarization is a very interesting phenomenon where, let's hypothetically say that you have some sort of opinion on who should be the next president of the United States. But it's just a light opinion. It's still early. You're just kind of leaning this direction. If you go and talk to that with somebody in an opposing view, your bias is going to become stronger. So basically, in defending your argument of why you want a specific person to become president to your friend who has a different view, you're going to then talk yourself even more into that idea. So that just makes you commit even more. And we have some issues here. Jury decision making is one of the biggest areas for group polarization. If you think about how a jury works, I don't know if any of you have ever served, but generally speaking, there's an initial vote, guilty, not guilty, and then people discuss, because it's not often that people come to a consensus right away. So people are going to discuss. So maybe, I don't know, maybe you're feeling not guilty, but it's just a gut feeling. By having to argue that position, you're then going to become more attached to it because you will have convinced yourself in the process of convincing others of that decision. Risky shift is a very interesting phenomenon, and this is where groups make riskier decisions. And this is very easy to explain, but part of it is due to group polarization. And the other part of it is due to anonymity. So there have been lots of gambling studies, and in these gambling studies, what they do is they have people, take money, gamble it on these games, then they'll have them do it by themselves, and then they'll have them do it with a group of people. And it was found that when people gamble by themselves, they tend to be much more conservative than when people are gambling in a group. And if you think about how people gamble in a group, that's not your money. If you're gambling by yourself, that's your money. If you're in a group, that's not your money. It's okay to make a risky decision. Secondly, if something goes wrong, it wasn't your fault. it was somebody else's fault. So groups tend to make riskier decisions. That's part of it. The other part of it is that whole conformity group think type of piece, where maybe, you know, if it's a high risk group, like say your boss calls an argument, or I mean a meeting, and asks for opinion on something, and people just agree with him instead of voicing their opinions, then the group will have possibly made a riskier decision just by not voicing other opinions. So there's really two mechanisms to the risky shift there. Okay, so we're going to switch and talk about stereotypes for just a little bit. And you'll see I have jazz hands there. It's a social psychology joke, and I would have shown you if I was in class, but we're not. So you'll just have to go with me. Stereotypes, jazz hands, social psychologist joke. Okay, so stereotypes are very common. And believe it or not, especially these days, we actually try and work very hard to counteract stereotypes and to try and get around stereotypes. That's why I'm going to talk about them for a little bit. There's all kinds of affirmative action motivations. There's trainings that you can go to try and get rid of your biases and stereotypes. And believe it or not, when I started down my path as a social psychologist, I said, the first thing I said was, I'm not studying stereotypes, because at first I found stereotypes pretty uninteresting. It was one of the least things that I liked in social psychology. But here I am. I do indeed study stereotypes now, to some extent, at least in some of my studies. And I've come to the conclusion that a lot of stuff just works its way back to stereotypes, because a lot of our group behavior and social behavior is actually dictated by our stereotypes. So it's pretty interesting. Okay, so to talk about stereotypes, we kind of have to talk about how we organize our thoughts. Now, a schema is a whole mental picture of what you have going on. It's a concept, it's an idea. So think about when you were thinking about coming to the Citadel. You had some sort of ideas about the school. They could be true, they could be not true, but you had this connected web of ideas that went with that one concept of the Citadel. That's a schema. Now, all stereotypes are they're a simple categorization. So all we're doing is classifying things into groups. It makes a lot of sense because, as we've talked about several times, we get a lot of stimuli all the time, and we need shortcuts. And one of the best shortcuts is to just put things in categories. And that's all a stereotype is. You can have good stereotypes, you can have bad stereotypes, you can have neutral stereotypes. It's not all bad, it's just classifying things into groups. Now, typically speaking, stereotypes have a category-based expectancy. So that means you look at something, it hits all these check marks on the list, and it's like, oh, it's part of that group. Right? I see an animal, it's got whiskers, it's got pointy ears, it's got claws, likes to be in a tree, and it's hunting a mouse. I'm going to call that a cat. I have an expectancy of that group and what they do. Typically, these things are assigned based on what you see. So when we talked about first impressions, we talked about how first impressions are made very quickly, typically before we even talk to somebody. Well, we do the same things with stereotypes. We've got to process stimuli very, very quickly. Remember, our sensory memory is basically not memory. We have to pay attention to stuff to even get it in our memory. Right? So we need to process these things very fast. So we see something, we classify it, we put it in a stereotype group, and we're done. So an example of that would be, you know, Well, it's actually, I have the bullet points wrong. This is actually kind of a category-based example here of how we think that people should be due to their sex, right? We have, you know, for males and females, we have ideas about how those people should act, and based on how people act, we just put them in the group. And we can put them in the group based on what we see. And then stereotypes tend to be prescriptive. And it's this interesting quirk of stereotypes, but with stereotypes, people tend to act in ways that confirm some sort of stereotype about them. And that's what we mean by prescriptive. It not only describes your behavior, it can dictate your behavior. And so that's what the prescriptive means. So stereotypes are a form of heuristic, and I know we went over heuristics a little while ago. But again, that's just a quick mental shortcut. That's all a heuristic is. It's like a mental shortcut. And so all of this makes it so that stereotypes are pretty self-maintaining. Generally speaking, we're going to remember information that confirms our stereotype rather than disconfirms our stereotype. You can think about it back when we were talking about belief perseverance. You can kind of think about it that way. If you work at a restaurant and you think all the crazy people come in for the full moon, you're going to notice those people and remember them. But you're going to forget the 50 other people that weren't crazy, even though there were more of them. We do the same thing with stereotypes. We notice things that confirm our stereotypes and kind of ignore or do not remember things that don't confirm our stereotypes. Now, stereotypes can lead to in-group and out-group favoritism, and this is pretty easy to define. So with an out-group, we tend to view the out-group as very homogeneous. Everybody in the out-group looks alike and acts alike. Whereas in our in-group, we see differences in people and we're more likely to give favors, resources, and be more understanding to people in our own group. You can think about it this way. When you graduate from here, you're going to be a Citadel graduate, right? I'm never going to be a Citadel graduate. So if you and I applied for a job and it was the Citadel graduate hiring, they might give you some in-group favoritism, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. They went to the Citadel, they know what it's like, and they know what you can do. So even though it's called favoritism, it has good and bad pieces to it too. You know, maybe they want to hire somebody from the Citadel because they're very good workers, right? And they know what you went through. Maybe they just want to hand out a favor to a fellow alumni. You never know, but that's kind of what in-group favoritism is. So I want to talk about a little study that kind of demonstrates all of this stuff. It's a pretty cool study. And this actually happened, and you can actually go tour this camp to this day. So it's the summer of 1961. You're 12 years old. Your parents send you to summer camp in Oklahoma. When you get there, you're going to be either a rattler or an eagle. So you're assigned to one of two groups. Generally speaking, for like the first week of camp, you didn't know that there was another group of kids there at all. You thought you were the only group of kids. But then like the next week, you find out there's another group, and then they make you compete in athletic competitions. Now you can think about this, think about it for a second, but what do you think happened here? We had two groups, 12-year-old boys competing in athletic competitions. What went on? Again, this was a real study, and another reason why psychologists can't do anything fun anymore. As you can see here, the groups were kept separate at first, because they wanted to get the kids to bond with people in their group. They wanted them to form an in-group. And then once that had happened, they pitted them against each other. And it actually escalated pretty quickly and pretty badly for 12-year-old boys. You got to remember, this is the 1960s. So at first there was just, verbal prejudice, but then, people started raiding each other's bunks and there was vandalism going on. And then finally the groups became really aggressive towards each other and the researchers separated them. So it got to a physical violence point, and that's where the researchers stepped in and said, hey, nope, we need to stop this. This was an actual flag that the researchers found during some tournament that they had the kids do. Again, remember 1960s, 12-year-olds. They're getting a little aggressive for some fake camp competitions, but that was the whole idea behind the study. Here's the actual study hypothesis written by Sheriff and Sheriff in their work prior to doing the study. So typically speaking, when you write up psychological studies and you're working on a series of experiments, in your previous work you'll kind of give hints and document, what your next study is going to be like. So this was their actual study hypothesis. And at the end of the study, they found some interesting conclusions. Obviously, group conflict arises from differences in goal. We already knew that kind of, but this research study scientifically showed it. More interestingly, they found some really big implications for people in terms of leadership. One group actually had a way more effective leader than the other group. And they found that the one that had the better leader, that leader actually considered the atmosphere of the group and considered the group members before moving forward. Whereas the leader of the other group didn't regard the opinions and things of his members as much as group one. Okay, so they found that for effective leadership, somebody needs to actually consider the atmosphere in the group. Is everybody getting along? Is it cohesive? And the opinions of people in the group. So, of course, they went back and fixed the situation. And what they did to fix it is they gave them common goals. So guys, all work together, accomplish this one task, to try and promote it to be all an in-group. Get them to work together, so to speak. And you can see in these two graphs, the rattlers have the two graphs on the left, the eagles, two graphs on the right. The solid bar, well, they had the boys groups rate how many people were their friends in each group. So the solid bar is the amount of people that were in their own group, and the little lined bar, that's the amount of people they selected in the other group. So, for example, you can see here on this very far left graph, you can see that like 90% of the friend choices on the rattlers were chosen in group at the end of stage 2. That's at the end of the competition. So remember, stage 1, bond with the group members. Stage 2, competition. Stage 3 is the common goal. Well, if you look at the end of stage 3 on the rattlers, you'll see that just barely over half of the people that they've chosen are now their in-group choices. And they've chosen quite a few people that are out-group choices at that point. So Sheriff and Sheriff decided that this right here tells us a lot about what we can do to promote teamwork. Now, I do want to point out, if you look over at the Eagles, they did not make as many friends in the out-group. The eagles were the side that were shown to have the less effective leader. Okay, so the more communal leader was in the rattlers, and that leader was more effective at getting people to integrate. The self-fulfilling prophecy is a pretty interesting idea with stereotypes, and this is the whole idea that we have a tendency to behave in ways that confirm others' expectations. A little piece of that is stereotype threat. So we'll start with the self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's say, I know we've gone over Southern people in class before. So I have an expectation of how I think Southern people should act, right? And do you think that promotes anybody actually acting that way when they're around me because they know that's my expectation? Probably so. Research shows that we will actually confirm others' expectations, and that's all self-fulfilling prophecy is. Or you can look at it this way of, I don't know, I'm female and in the workplace, and I know people tend to expect me to dress femininely in the workplace, so all my business clothes tend to be really feminine. Something like that. That would be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Stereotype threat is a more unique concept and actually changed the way that we do standardized tests to this day. So stereotype threat is the idea that if I remind you of a stereotype about your group, then it can have a number of lasting effects, including physiological stress, so higher heart rate, skin conductance, and all those measures that show stress, those go up. Typically, if you're thinking about that performance, it's very distracting to the task at hand. And then the last thing is trying to suppress all the negative thoughts and emotions that's going on. That requires a lot of effort. That's a little troublesome. Okay, that's hard to do, and again, distracts you from your task. So I'm going to show you an example of stereotype threat to kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about here, because I know it's a little unclear just looking at the definition, but I'm going to give you an idea. Okay, so we have this study. This is a very classic study in social psychology. So they took black and white people to be participants in this study, and what they did is they just randomly assigned them to two groups. Group one was told that they're going to take a diagnostic exam of intellectual ability. Group two is just told that they're going to fill out a small exam. And then afterwards, they measured exam performance. Here are your results. So you can see here that the white participants are performing similarly, whether it's told it's diagnostic or not diagnostic. But the black participants were performing quite a bit worse when told diagnostic, and equivalent with the white participants when told it wasn't diagnostic. So what they theorized is that since there is a stereotype, or at least at the time the study was done, there was a stereotype that black people were not as smart. By reminding them of that stereotype by saying you have to take a diagnostic exam actually hurt their performance. Now they've done several iterations of this where they have measured things like physiological stress, and it does indeed go up. It causes people to be, their heart rate to go higher and them to be very stressed out. And they've done it with multiple groups of people. I know there's been one done with Asian people and white people where they were giving them a math exam, so you can kind of think about, based on your stereotype there, you can kind of think about what those results looked like. But that's what stereotype threat is. So with these people taking a diagnostic exam and reminded of a stereotype about themselves, they were probably having, a lot of physiological stress. Thinking about how they were doing was probably distracting them from the actual task. And then they had to suppress constant negative thoughts during the task. So all of that created a statistically significantly lower score there. And then finally, this is going to be the last little piece I go over. Our stereotypes tend to be a circular relationship. Okay? Our stereotypes, once we have them, they create expectancies on how we expect others to behave, which then influences how people do behave, which only reinforce our stereotypes. So these things are very, very hard to break. Like I said before, there's all kinds of trainings and people trying to improve biases in the workplace. Not that stereotypes always lead to biases, but people are really trying to improve this situation. Unfortunately, it's pretty slow going because stereotypes are just a natural mental shortcut that we do to reduce the amount of items we have to process in a day. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and we'll go over a couple more things in class on Wednesday, and then we'll start with social influence, which is my favorite lecture of the year, and I think you guys will all like it. So I will see you Wednesday.